but I would say that we're actually starting from different fundamental axioms. Like the fundamental axiom that I'm playing with is something that was basically expressed by Nietzsche, and it's a definition of truth. And so I would say if it doesn't serve life, it's not true. But so what we're arguing about is
but Jordan, I have to pull the brakes there. I mean, I agree morally, ethically, given my concern about the well-being of humanity. I agree with that as a moral starting point. We want to know what is worth knowing. We don't want to know everything, and we certainly don't want to know truths that will get us all killed or make us all needlessly miserable.
Okay.
We want good lives, right?
Okay, so then I would say that by making that proposition, you've accepted the claim
but
that the scientific endeavor should be nested inside a moral endeavor.
Yes, absolutely. I accept that claim, but
well, then it can't be then the moral endeavor can't be grounded in the scientific endeavor, because the inside thing can't ground the outside thing. It's logically not possible.
I would disagree there, but let's talk about that when we talk about morality, because I think that's a great conversation to have. But here we're getting bogged down on the concept of truth. I think you can't have a concept of truth that is subordinate to well-being. You want well-being, I will grant you that, and my definition of well-being is quite expansive, and it just remains to be discovered what in the end will conduce to the greatest flourishing of minds like our own and minds beyond our own. As you say, when we integrate ourselves with our supercomputers, who knows what beauty we'll experience and what meaning will be available to us. I'm interested in all of that, and I want us all to survive, and I don't want to be annihilated by true facts that were dangerous to know. But
it seems to me then, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me, and believe me, this point I'm pushing is part of the reason that I got to where I got. It's exactly this issue, because I realized that it was necessary for our attitude towards science to be nested in something else, which was a higher moral conception. And if I'm not mistaken, you just made the claim that, if there are scientific things that we could mess with that might destroy us all, it would be better if we didn't. Okay?
Yes, but
by what standard?
We will get there, but they will be no less true. You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths.
Okay, well then I would say that I don't think that facts are necessarily true. So I don't think that scientific facts, even if they're correct from within the domain that they were generated, I don't think that necessarily makes them true. And I know that I'm gerrymandering the definition of truth, but I'm doing that on purpose because I'm trying to nest truth within a Darwinian framework, which I think is a moral framework. And I think that the logic of your argument about morality is going to push you in the same direction, inevitably.
You're choosing, following Nietzsche here, you're choosing to use the word true. You're choosing to freight it with some moral concerns that will make it very difficult for people to understand what you mean and for you to understand what they mean when you use truth as a synonym for, as you just said, correct. A fact may be correct, but it's not true.
Right.
It seems to me this is counterproductive, and you lose nothing by granting that the truth value of a proposition can be evaluated whether or not this is a fact worth knowing or whether or not it's dangerous to know.
No, but that's the thing I don't agree with, because I think that that's the kind of conception of what constitutes a fact that does in fact present a moral danger to people, a mortal danger to people. And I also think that that's partly why the scientific endeavor, as it's demolished the traditional underpinnings of our moral systems, has produced an emergent nihilism and hopelessness among people that makes them more susceptible to ideological possession. I think it's a fundamental problem. And I do believe that the highest truths, let's put it that way, the highest truths are moral truths. I'm thinking of that from a Darwinian
I
perspective.
need to break in here, Jordan, because I just think you're not noticing the price you are paying for redefining a word like truth. And, ironically, it's probably even a steeper price than what these gender pronoun maniacs are attempting to pay for asking that everyone use their favorite word to describe their identity. Truth is a bedrock conception. It's not just a scientific one. It's a journalistic one. It's an interpersonal one, and it is a...
Okay, good. Well, let's flip to that.
It's that to which our very sanity is anchored, and I think you tug at this anchor at your peril.
Right, definitely. Believe me, I'm perfectly aware of that. It's put me in peril many times, but I would also point out that people were getting along just fine without an empirical conception of the world for millions and millions of years, and animals still manage it. So they're obviously operating on some level of representation of reality that doesn't require articulated empirical investigation.
It's possible to survive without having a clear notion of truth, but it's probably not possible to be reliably understood in a conversation about scientific reality or the relationship between mind and matter or anything else that we're trying to talk about here. And so let me just point out a few things. It seems to me what you're doing here is you are marrying the concept of truth, which is an epistemological one, also to the concept of goodness. And maybe you want to freight it even more with the concept of beauty. You're going to fuse truth and goodness and perhaps even beauty together as this kind of jewel that can't be spoken about in its terms of its separate parts because they are fused now. But this creates a few problems. So for instance, if you are going to talk about truth as being inseparable from goodness, and goodness being a matter of what happens in the end, but we never really reach the end necessarily. We're just moving forward in time. So what happens here is we'll have all of these descriptions of reality and ways of talking about it and things we can do technologically on the basis of this advancement in our conception of things. All of that can be going forward quite nicely. All of it can seem true and beneficial and tending toward the good. But then something happens, which on the basis of what we know and what we perhaps only dimly understand, just winds up killing us, right? And then what you now have to do is go back in time and say all of the things we had good reason to believe were true weren't because of this fatal episode at the end. And then if you had a separate population of people who believed all the same things, but because of some contingent difference in their situation, those truths, now in scare quotes, those truths didn't wind up killing them, but they went on to flourish perfectly by their light.
Well, then I would say that the contingent difference that you're describing would be significant.
It's clearly significant for their survival, but how can it be significant for the truth? I mean, it could be just as...
I don't accept the proposition that a contingent event that wasn't related to definitions of the truth could produce the divergent outcome that you propose.
I just gave you one. I mean, granted, it's a cockamamie example, but it's...
Yeah, I know, but that's the problem.
Take my terrorist. We could put you in a situation where knowing something or not knowing something would get you killed. And yet, the fact that it would get you killed doesn't reach into the truth value of the statement. If there's someone going around Toronto killing people for not being able to name all the U.S. presidents in sequence. And let's say he's wrong about what the sequence is. So if you give him a sequence that is in fact inaccurate, that is untrue, but it works for him and you survive, it doesn't make it true, right? I mean, you need a concept of truth that flows through.
It makes it true enough to survive.
Yes, it makes it useful. It's a good thing you got the wrong sequence, but
I did tell you at the beginning that I was a pragmatist nested in Darwinism. And look, and I've got one more thing here. You dragged me down this pathway claiming that I'm going to run into all sorts of trouble by conflating truth and beauty and goodness. But you're doing exactly the same thing when you claim that there can be a scientific basis for morality. You're just inverting the causal order. I'm doing it from a pragmatic perspective, and you're doing it from a scientific perspective.
But it's not pragmatic.
Well, I think it is, because I don't think that you can come up with a moral conception that isn't pragmatic. You think you can, but I don't think you can. So And I'm not. It's not like you don't put your arguments forward with power and coherence. They're powerful arguments, and I'm not saying that I'm right.
You are saying that you're right in the sense that you're not persuaded by the argument here. It seems to me that you have to grapple with this, or at the very least, I need to move forward knowing exactly what you're claiming here, and I don't believe that I do.
First of all, I have kids. I wouldn't tell them that a porcupine.
I'm sure you wouldn't, but why use the word truth though?
Because the question is, why do people tell you that a porcupine can throw its quills?
I don't think they do.
Oh, they do.
Well, if they do, they don't know any better.
Right.
Or they're liars.
Right. And so all I'm saying is that actually that is likely to be the product of selection. In other words, that those people who had encoded that they do throw their quills have an advantage. It's not the way I would do it, and for exactly the reason that you point out, which is if you give a child the wrong model of a porcupine, I don't know whether a porcupine is liable to be the gateway to some more important question, but if it were, you've just steered the kid wrong.
Well, it's something. Here's part of the problem, and this is and this is a really big problem. There's two things, I guess, that were brought up by what you described, and the first is the terminology of truth. Now, Harris's claim with regards to my utilization of truth was that I was absconding with the definition of truth in a false manner, but he was wrong, because the idea of truth is much older than the idea of objective truth. And the original notion of truth wasn't objective true. It was like the arrow flies straight and true. Right, and it meant something like reliably on its way to the appropriate destination, something like that. And when Christ said, "I am the truth and the way," I can't remember the other one. Yes. The truth he was talking about wasn't an objective truth. So Sam's idea that I had somehow, taken the idea of truth that was actually objective all along and done something crooked with it is just wrong. It's wrong.
Well, so truth can have multiple definitions.
Well, that's that's the issue, and that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. Is like there's two kinds of truth, and they may be commensurate. You may be able to stack them on top of one another, but now and then they dissociate, and this is actually what Bret was referring to as well. So, and this is where it gets so complicated that I can barely manage it. There's the truth that manifests itself in the manner in which you act. And there's the truth that manifests itself as a representation of the objective world. And sometimes both those truths are stacked on top of each other. And sometimes they're not. So like I could give you a piece of wisdom that would work well if you acted it out, that carried within it an inaccurate representation of part of the objective world. And you could say, well, maybe that's actually the case with the biblical stories, because if you read them as science, they don't read well.
So let's take malaria as a good example. Malaria, the root of the word is malaria, bad air, right? Malaria is not transmitted by bad air. It's transmitted by mosquitoes that live in places where you might think the air is bad. So the point is it's part of the way there. Right?
Yeah, that's a good one. And that also gets, see, there's another weird distinction here, and that I was trying to draw with Sam, but that's a really tricky one. And we augured in because we started to talk about pragmatism, but there's also something like the truth of a description and the truth of a tool. And my sense is that people's fundamental truths are tool-like. We use them to function properly in the world. And you could say, well, a sharp axe is more true than a dull axe. And actually, you can use the word true in that sense. That actually is an appropriate use of the word. There are tool truths and there are objective fact truths. Now, and in the optimal circumstance, those map onto each other. But we're not smart enough often to make them map onto each other because we just don't know enough. And there are lots of truths that we have that portray the objective world improperly that are still true.
Is the problem using the term true when sometimes you should use the term fact? Like
yes.
1 + 1 is 2, that is a fact. 1 + 1 is 2 is also true. You throw some water on a match, that is, and it'll go out. That's a fact.
Yes.
Right?
Well, as I see it, at least, there is this overarching truth, the one that Sam Harris was pointing to, the one I think you're pointing to also, and the one I'm imagining we all subscribe to.
Sure.
Right? There is the testable truth that reveals itself in the laboratory or in a careful experiment in the field. And that really is the top-level truth. But then there are the truths you can't speak yet. So let's take the word filth from the Old Testament. Okay, filth means shit, right? You're not supposed to shit in camp because God finds it offensive. Now, the problem is the germ theory of disease doesn't come about for thousands of years after that truth was written. That truth keeps you from infecting people long before you can ever explain that there are microbes that grow in humans that are a particular danger to your population. So the point is, would you rather be held back to the place where you can actually describe the literal underpinnings of what's going on, or do you want to be liberated to say something that actually results in an improvement in health before, literally thousands of years before anybody had any idea that it was microbes at the root of this?
Yes, and you need to figure out, so an elaboration of that would be something like human beings needed to figure out how to act without dying before they could understand the nature of the world well enough to justify that.
Right, and
you'd
be crazy, now that we do have the germ theory of disease, to amplify that original crude version of the truth, or that crude approximation of what you need to believe in order to behave safely. There's no reason for that truth to be promoted. In fact, you don't hear people describing this part of the Old Testament anymore because it's not relevant.
Right.
And this is probably all why dietary restrictions were in the Old Testament as well. Shellfish, red tide, eating pigs, trichinosis. There's a lot of issues that go along with that.
Yeah, well, there is some intermingling, perhaps, of hygienic concerns with also the desire for the groups to distinguish themselves from other groups, right? Because you can unite your group quite tightly by dietary restrictions. So, back to your point about terminology, we could do something like fact and wisdom. You say truth, that's the overarching category, and then that divides into fact and wisdom. And what you want optimally is you want the facts and the wisdom to be one to one, but often they're not. And if you find wisdom where the facts aren't laid right out, you don't just get to throw away the wisdom, which is what I think happens in the case of people like Dawkins and Harris. And Harris makes another sleight of hand move, which I don't like, which is that he thinks, so let's say, except for just a second, the wisdom-fact distinction, he would say, well, the fact is the thing, and the wisdom is a second-order derivation of that. You can ground the wisdom in the fact, and I don't believe that, and I don't think that he has any real justification for that claim. And this is something I never got.
What do you mean by grounding the wisdom in the fact?
He thinks if you know the facts clearly enough, you'll know how to act.
Well, that's not necessarily true.
Well, there's
ways to act that are within your best interest, and then there's ways to act that are within the interest of all the people around you, but might not serve you that well.
Well, there's
and
also
that distinction is where ethics come
right,
in.
Where the consequences are delayed for some number of generations or something like that.
Yes, well, that's a big problem. And so Sam acts as if the process of mapping facts onto action is simple if we just got the facts right. But it's the weakest part of his argument, and we never ever got to that for a variety of reasons. But part of the reason it's weak is, there's like an infinite number of facts, man. So let's say you're standing in front of a field and you're looking at the field. The field does not tell you how to walk through it. There's a million ways through the field. And no matter how many facts about the field you aggregate, you're not going to be able to determine the appropriate path by aggregating those facts. So that's a problem that I don't think Sam is willing to take seriously.